6 times across 3 centuries, rulers tried to ban coffee. 6 times, they failed. In 1511, the governor of Mecca convened a council of scholars and physicians, declared the drink dangerous and ungodly, and ordered every coffeehouse in the holy city shuttered. The ban lasted weeks. He was reportedly executed not long after, on orders from a sultan who happened to enjoy his morning cup. In 1633, the Ottoman Sultan Murad IV made the stakes considerably clearer. He walked the streets of Constantinople in commoner's clothing, a 100-pound sword at his side, looking for anyone he could find sipping coffee after dark. Those he found, he reportedly beheaded on the spot. The ban held only as long as his terror did, which is to say, only until he died. In Venice, Catholic clergy petitioned the Pope to forbid this dark beverage from Muslim lands, calling it the bitter invention of Satan. And in London, on December 29, 1675, King Charles II issued a royal proclamation ordering the closure of every coffeehouse in England. He reversed himself on January 8, 1676, 11 days. Even a king of England could not keep people from their coffee. Every single ban failed. At the center of all of it was something remarkably unimposing. A small, bitter red berry, no larger than a grape, growing wild in the highland forests of Africa that nobody had cultivated, nobody had sought, and nobody for most of history had even noticed. They called it the devil's drink. They called it the bitter invention of Satan, the wine of Arabia, the drink of infidels. They put men to death for it, burned it in fires, issued proclamations and edicts and fatwas to stop it spreading. And the more they tried to stop it, the further it spread. This is the story of coffee. It begins not in a cafe, not in a shop, not in anything that looks remotely like civilization. It begins in a forest. The highland forests of what is now southwestern Ethiopia are dense and cool, rising above the Great Rift Valley in a tangle of wild trees. The air at that altitude is thin and sharp with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and faintly ferocious, coming from the small red berries that cluster along the branches of one tree in particular. Among those trees, for reasons that had nothing to do with human ambition, grew Coffea arabica, the coffee plant. It grew wild in the region called Kaffa, which is very likely where the word coffee comes from, though the etymology is educated guesswork threaded through with legend, exactly like so much else in the early story. What is certain is this: the plant was there. People noticed. The nomadic Oromo people, indigenous to the Ethiopian highlands, are widely believed to have been among the first to recognize what the coffee cherry could do. They appear to have chewed the berries raw, mixed the crushed seeds with animal fat, used them as sustenance on long travels, a kind of fuel. No manuscript records this with precision. It sits in the tradition of peoples whose knowledge moved by word and practice rather than by ink. And then there is Kaldi. The story has been told for centuries, which means it should be treated exactly as stories told for centuries usually should be, as a legend, possibly rooted in something true, certainly rooted in something felt. In this widely repeated account, a young Ethiopian goat herd named Kaldi noticed sometime around the 9th century that his goats refused to sleep after eating the red berries of a particular shrub. They danced, according to the tale. He tried the berries himself and felt a brightness, a loosening of the body's fatigue. He brought the berries to a nearby monastery, where the monks called them the devil's work and flung them into the fire. Then something happened that no one planned. The beans roasted in the flames. A smell rose from them unlike anything in that mountain air before. Something dark and warm and roasted and alive. Something that pulled people toward it, before they could explain why. They raked the beans from the embers, dissolved them in hot water, and drank the result. They stayed awake all night for prayers. The first cup of coffee, in this account, was pulled from a fire by people who had just tried to destroy it. Whether Kaldi was a real person does not matter in the end. The plant is real. Ethiopia is genuinely its homeland. What we know with confidence is what came next. Sometime in the 15th century, Coffea arabica crossed the Red Sea to the mountain monasteries of Yemen. There, Sufi monks of the Shadhiliya order discovered what the plant could do. They roasted the seeds, brewed them in boiling water, and produced a drink they called kahwa. The word kahwa had originally meant a kind of wine in Arabic. The Sufis borrowed it for coffee because both substances altered something in the body. In this case, what altered was not judgment, it was wakefulness. The monks drank it through the long nights of their devotional rituals, the chanting and prayer that ran until dawn. Coffee was not pleasure. It was a devotional tool, a practical instrument of faith. It tasted bitter and left the tongue faintly dry. It smelled extraordinary, and it kept them present when every muscle wanted to surrender to sleep. It was, in this sense, the most innocent beginning imaginable. From those monastery walls, coffee moved into Yemeni cities, and from Yemeni cities onto ships. The port of Mocha, or Al-Muka, sat on Yemen's Red Sea coast, and by the early 16th century, it had become the only gateway through which coffee left the known world. The Yemenis understood exactly what they had. They cultivated the plant across the western highlands, in the mountain terraces of Haraz and Bani Matar. They boiled the seeds before exporting them, a deliberate act of sabotage against any potential rival, to ensure no living plant could ever be grown from their supply. Yemen did not merely produce coffee, it held it the way a fortress holds a spring. From Mocha, coffee moved north. It reached Mecca and Medina, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad. And in 1554, it reached Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire, where it encountered a city built for exactly the kind of gathering it was about to make possible. Walk into a kahvehane in 16th century Constantinople, and you would find low cushioned benches along the walls, the air thick with smoke, and the deep roasted smell of coffee being prepared over coals. A dozen conversations running at different volumes across every corner of the room. Backgammon tiles clicked against wooden boards. Someone near the entrance was reading aloud from a broadsheet pinned to the wall. For the price of a cup, a man could stay for hours. The communal tables had no rank assigned to them. Merchants sat beside scholars. Tradesmen sat beside poets. The historian Ibrahim Pechevi, writing in the 1640s, noted that coffeehouses drew all sorts of people, the learned and the ignorant, the wise and the foolish. This was not how the world was organized. In a society shaped by birth and faith and the hierarchy of the court, the shared table was a rupture. Coffee made it possible in a way that wine and ale could not. Alcohol dulled, coffee sharpened. The people inside a coffeehouse were awake, alert, talking in full sentences, following each other's reasoning, finishing each other's arguments. They called these places the schools of the wise. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman court employed an official coffee maker, a formal position in the imperial household. Coffee had traveled from Sufi monastery to imperial ceremony in less than 100 years. But that same quality, the way it kept people awake and talking and gathering as equals, was precisely the quality that was about to cause it serious trouble. The trouble began in Mecca in 1511. Khair Beg was the market inspector of the city, a man who had climbed to authority and who understood, in the way that people with authority tend to understand things, that power requires the absence of organized opposition. He had heard what was being said about him in coffeehouses. Satirical verses, unflattering comparisons, the kind of mockery that only circulates freely in a room where men feel safe from consequence. He moved against them. In June of 1511, Kaya Beg convened a council of jurists and physicians. He produced 2 witnesses who swore under oath that coffee was intoxicating, comparable to wine, forbidden under Islamic law. The council agreed. The coffee houses of Mecca were shuttered, the coffee stocks were burned, the ruling was sent to Cairo. The Mamluk Sultan was himself a coffee drinker. He reversed the ban immediately. Kaya Beg was removed from his post. Some accounts say he was executed. The ban had lasted weeks. In 1633, Sultan Murad IV decreed death for coffee drinkers in Constantinople. He walked the streets in disguise. He meant it. Coffee houses closed. People drank in private, in darkened rooms, in quiet cups behind locked doors. The ban held only as long as Murad did. He died in 1640. The coffee houses reopened. And in Venice, as coffee arrived through Mediterranean trade routes, the Catholic clergy delivered their verdict. They called it the bitter invention of Satan. They petitioned Pope Clement VIII, who served from 1592 to 1605, to formally condemn it for all Christians. The Pope asked for a cup. He tasted it. The story, widely told, says he declared it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of something so delicious, and that he would baptize it instead. Whatever the exact words, the verdict was clear. Coffee was acceptable. The first coffee house in Rome opened in 1645. Coffee had survived its most powerful enemies, but none of them had yet understood the real problem. They could not suppress it, so long as Yemen controlled the only living seeds in the world. Yemen had built its wall carefully. For nearly 2 centuries, no live coffee plant had left the peninsula with permission. The seeds were boiled before export. The trees were watched. The trade was too valuable to share. Then the wall cracked slowly, from multiple directions at once. The first breach came from faith, not commerce. Sometime in the early 17th century, a Muslim pilgrim known as Baba Budan made the Hajj to Mecca. On his return journey, he carried secreted against his body 7 live coffee seeds, 7. He planted them in the Chikmagalur hills of Karnataka in southern India. They grew. A mountain range in Karnataka still bears his name. 7 seeds. That was enough to begin. In 1616, a Dutch merchant named Peter van den Broeke smuggled a living coffee plant from Yemen to the Amsterdam Botanical Garden. The Dutch were patient. They established plantations in Java by 1690 and were supplying all of Europe's coffee demand by 1719. The English word Java traces directly to this moment. In 1706, a plant traveled from Java back to Amsterdam. In 1713, the Dutch gave one as a diplomatic gift to King Louis XIV of France, installed in a royal greenhouse in Paris. And from that single tree, kept under glass in a king's garden, comes one of the most extraordinary voyages in the history of agriculture. A French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu became convinced that Martinique would be perfect for coffee. He could not get permission to take a cutting, so he went at night and took one anyway. The crossing nearly killed the plant. Tunisian pirates menaced the ship. A violent storm threatened to sink it. A jealous passenger tried to wrestle the cutting away and broke off a branch in the struggle. Then the water rations ran low. Declieux wrote about what happened next in a letter published in a French literary journal. He shared his own ration with the plant. Weeks at sea with barely enough water for himself, he gave the seedling half. He got it to Martinique alive. Within 50 years, nearly 19 million coffee trees grew on that island. From that single cutting, stolen from a king's garden and kept alive on a sailor's own water, descended most of the coffee that would come to dominate the Americas. In 1727, The Portuguese sent a lieutenant colonel named Francisco de Melo Paleta to French Guiana on a faked diplomatic mission. He charmed the French governor's wife. When the mission concluded, she pressed a farewell bouquet of flowers into his hands. Concealed inside it were coffee seeds. Those seeds became Brazil. Coffee reached Europe, and Europe was not ready for it. England's first coffeehouse opened in Oxford in 1650, established by a Lebanese merchant named Jacob. London followed 2 years later. You paid 1 penny for your cup, and you could stay for the afternoon. The tablecloths were splashed with coffee rings. Newspapers were pinned warm and ink-fresh to the walls. Voices overlapped from every bench and corner. By the early 18th century, London had somewhere between 500 and 600 coffeehouses serving a city of roughly 600,000 people. They called these rooms penny universities because for the price of a single cup, any man could sit at a communal table and join whatever argument was already underway. From those rooms came the institutions that still run the world. Edward Lloyd's coffeehouse on Tower Street opened around 1686, where maritime merchants gathered to trade intelligence on shipping risks, became Lloyd's of London. Jonathan's coffeehouse on Change Alley, where brokers bought and sold shares, became the London Stock Exchange. In Paris, the Café de Procope opened in 1686, and Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot became regulars, thinking through the ideas that became the French Enlightenment. King Charles II issued his proclamation for the suppression of coffeehouses on December 29, 1675. Coffeehouses, the proclamation declared, spread diverse false, malicious, and scandalous reports to the defamation of His Majesty's government. He ordered them all closed. The public outcry was immediate and furious. His own ministers refused to accept it. He reversed himself on January 8, 1676. 11 days. The King of England lasted 11 days. In Paris in 1789, Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a table at the Café de Foire and called the crowd to arms. The storming of the Bastille followed the next day. When the American colonies threw British tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, coffee became the patriotic drink by default. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, called by Daniel Webster the headquarters of the Revolution, was where Paul Revere and Samuel Adams planned independence. Something that started as a Sufi monk's aid to midnight prayer had become the engine of the modern world. Today, roughly 2.25 billion cups of coffee are consumed every single day. It is the second most traded commodity on Earth after crude oil. More than 25 million farming families depend on it for their livelihoods. Brazil, whose entire industry descended from seeds pressed into a farewell bouquet in 1727, now produces approximately 40% of the world's supply. But here is the part that should stop you cold. Almost all of it is vulnerable. Nearly every Arabica coffee plant on Earth, every espresso pulled in an Italian bar, every pour-over brewed in a Tokyo cafe, every bag of beans sold from Amsterdam to Nairobi, descends from a tiny number of plants smuggled out of Yemen between the 17th and 18th centuries. Declieu's 1 cutting, Paleta's bouquet seeds, Baba Budan's 7. The genetic bottleneck created by those stolen plants is so narrow that Arabica coffee, the most beloved variety on Earth, has almost no genetic diversity. It is, in botanical terms, very nearly a monoculture. A fungus called Hemilea vastatrix, coffee leaf rust, has already swept through Central American farms this century, devastating harvests across Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. Scientists warn that climate change is shrinking the band of land where Arabica can grow. Some projections suggest that by 2050, up to half of current growing regions could become unsuitable. The bean that outlasted governors and sultans and kings and popes may yet face an enemy it cannot charm, bribe, or survive through stubbornness alone. And the answer, according to agricultural scientists working right now in the field, lives in the highland forests of Ethiopia. The wild Coffea arabica trees growing untouched in Kaffa and Yirgacheffe carry more genetic diversity than all the world's plantations combined. Centuries of smuggling and bottlenecks and monoculture farming have stripped that variation out of the global supply. What survived intact, what the world may need most, is in the forest where it all began. The world may have to go back to the beginning to save what the beginning started. Consider what happened. A wild berry in the forests of Africa, chewed by nomadic people for energy, became the devotional drink of mystics who needed to stay awake for God. It crossed centuries of persecution, outlawed by governors and sultans and clergy, condemned across 3 faiths and 3 centuries, survived fire and edict and a 100-pound sword. It escaped its homeland through the faith of a pilgrim, the ambition of a trading empire, the obsession of a naval officer willing to share his own water with a seedling, and the charm of a colonel at a farewell. It crossed the Atlantic and built the coffee house, and inside the coffee house it built Lloyd's of London and the London Stock Exchange and the plans for 2 revolutions. Every ruler who tried to suppress it understood something real. The coffee house was dangerous. It was the room where a merchant and a philosopher and a tradesman sat at the same table, read the same newspaper, and made the same arguments as though they had the same right. It was where old hierarchies dissolved, not violently, not all at once, but cup by cup, conversation by conversation, across years and decades and centuries of people sitting down and talking to each other as though they were equals, because in those rooms they were. Now it faces a challenge that cannot be threatened or baptized or argued out of the room. A fungus does not care about proclamations. A warming planet does not negotiate. The answer may be waiting in a forest in Ethiopia, in trees that no one cultivated, no one sought, and no one for most of history even noticed. That is where it started. That may be where it is saved. They called it the devil's drink. And perhaps that is not so far wrong. The thing that wakes the mind, that keeps people from sleeping through injustice, that fills a room with strangers who disagree and holds them civil enough to keep talking. The thing that powered the arguments that became the institutions that became the freedoms many now take for granted. Of course, that seemed like the devil's work. Every force that has ever challenged power always did. 2.25 billion cups today. Every one of them. A small continuation of the same long argument. If any part of this story surprised you, drop a comment and tell us which. And if you want more history like this, subscribing takes about as long as 1 sip.